Far out in the cold waters of the East China Sea lies a fragment of human ambition turned into ruin, Hashima Island. To outsiders, it is nothing more than a relic, a decaying fortress of concrete stranded at sea. But to those who live on the shores of Nagasaki, Hashima is more than abandoned stone and rusting steel. It is an island of silence, a forbidden graveyard that no one dares to approach. From a distance, the island's silhouette rises like a battleship cutting through the waves. Its high concrete walls, erected to protect against storms, now look like ramparts of a sunken fortress. Beyond them, towering apartment blocks stand in eerie stillness, their windows shattered, gaping like empty eye sockets. The sea batters its edges day and night, waves crashing with relentless fury, as though nature itself is trying to reclaim the rock. Hashima was once alive. Decades ago, thousands of miners and their families lived there. Working the coal seams buried beneath the sea. The island was a hive of sound, laughter of children echoing through narrow alleys, the clatter of bicycles, the shriek of machinery from the mines. But when the coal dried up, the people left in waves. In 1974, the last ferry departed, and the island was abandoned overnight. What remained was not just silence, but a wound frozen in time. Beds were left unmade, toys scattered on the floor, dishes still sitting in cupboards. A city without people, preserved like a corpse. Yet not everything left with the ferries. The villagers along the coast whispered that the island never truly emptied. They say the souls of the miners who died in the depths of the tunnels still wander, bound to the rock that consumed their lives. Hundreds perished from collapse, disease, or sheer exhaustion, their bodies buried beneath concrete or cast into the sea. Their cries, it is said, still echo through the broken buildings when the night is heavy with fog. Fishermen avoid the island. Even the boldest will not cast their nets near its shores. They claim their lines snag on bones, that the sea around Hashima is cursed, swallowing boats in sudden storms. And those who have stepped foot on the island, urban explorers, thrill-seek, the curious return with hollow eyes, speaking little of what they felt in the ruins. A few never return at all. To the world, Hashima is a curiosity, a monument to industrial ambition. To those who know its shadow, it is something else entirely. It is not an island, it is a tomb, and its silence is not empty, it is listening. Aya had always been drawn to places that others feared. While her peers chased stories of politics or celebrities, she chased the forgotten ruins swallowed by vines, factories rusting under the rain, asylums where the air itself seemed heavy with despair. For her, journalism was not about fame. It was about uncovering truths left behind, stories carved into walls and objects long after the people had vanished. To Aya, the dead spoke louder than the living, if only one dared to listen. Hashima had haunted her thoughts for years. Ever since she first saw a photograph of the island, the grey concrete towers rising like tombstones from the sea, she felt an unshakable pull. Every article she read described it as abandoned, lifeless, and yet there was something in those images that told her otherwise, a weight, a presence. It was as though the island stared back at her through the photograph, daring her to come closer. When Aya told the locals of her plan to visit, their reactions were immediate and visceral. An old fisherman spat on the ground, muttering prayers under his breath. A woman at the market whispered, "It's cursed," and refused to meet Aya's eyes. Even the younger generation, who laughed at ghost stories, went pale at the mention of staying overnight on Hashima. They all said the same thing: the island keeps what it takes. Aya smiled politely, pretending to brush off their warnings, but inside, their fear only fed her determination. If everyone was so terrified, then there had to be something there worth uncovering. Perhaps it was the thrill of danger, or perhaps it was the gnawing emptiness left by her own past. Aya never admitted it aloud, but she carried her own ghosts. A brother lost in a factory accident when she was a child, a silence in her family that was never healed. Maybe that was why she was obsessed with the silence of places like Hashima. She believed that in ruins, in echoes, she might find answers. She prepared meticulously: camera, recorder, notebook, lantern, spare batteries. But beneath the professional mask, a darker desire lingered. She wanted not just to document Hashima, but to feel it, to walk its empty streets, to hear what others refused to hear, to touch the history that everyone else feared would touch them back. The night before her departure, Aya dreamed of the island. In her dream, she stood on its crumbling pier, the sea roaring behind her. The buildings loomed above, and the windows, hundreds of them, were filled with faces, blank, hollow faces staring down at her. She woke with her heart pounding, but instead of fear, she felt exhilaration. The island was calling her, and she had already decided to answer. The morning of her journey broke grey and heavy, the horizon smeared with clouds that bled into the restless sea. Aya stood at the pier, her backpack strapped tight against her shoulders, watching as the small boat prepared to depart. Its engine sputtered, coughing like an old man reluctant to rise from bed. The captain, a gaunt man with weathered skin, avoided her eyes as he secured the ropes. He hadn't agreed easily. Most boatmen flatly refused to sail to Hashima, no matter the price. This one had only relented after Aya pressed money into his calloused hands, and even then, his expression was grim, as though she had bought not a ticket, but her own doom. "You shouldn't go," he muttered, as she stepped onto the creaking deck. "The island, it doesn't let go." Aya offered him a tight smile, feigning confidence, but inside, his words struck a nerve. She had heard them before, whispered in the markets, murmured in dark corners. The repetition made them feel less like superstition and more like a prophecy. The boat pulled away from the shore, its bow slicing through choppy waves. The further they traveled, the quieter the world became. The hum of the engine was swallowed by the vastness of the sea, and the coastline of Nagasaki shrank into a blur of green and grey. Ahead, nothing but open water. Then, slowly, a shadow began to form on the horizon. Hashima. At first, it was only a jagged smudge against the sky, but with every passing minute, the shape grew sharper, darker, heavier. The island rose from the sea like a beast, half asleep, its concrete walls jutting upward, defiant against the waves. The buildings towered above the seawall, their windows shattered and hollow, staring like hundreds of dead eyes. The silhouette did indeed resemble a warship, massive, unyielding, menacing. But unlike a ship, it was anchored forever in the sea, unable to move, unable to die. Aya gripped the railing, her stomach twisting with a mixture of dread and excitement. The wind picked up as they drew closer, carrying with it the sharp temps of salt and something else, a sour, metallic scent, like rust mixed with decay. The sea grew rougher near the island, waves slamming against its walls with a violence that felt deliberate, as though the ocean itself wanted to keep intruders away. The captain slowed the boat, his knuckles white against the wheel. He refused to dock, stopping several meters away from the cracked concrete pier. "This is as far as I go," he said firmly, his voice edged with fear. "Step onto that island, and you're on your own." Aya nodded, her heart hammering as she lowered herself onto the pier. The moment her boots touched the cracked surface, a chill rippled through her body. The air was different here, heavy, thicker, as though she had crossed an unseen barrier. The island greeted her not with silence, but with presence. She felt it pressing down on her, filling her lungs, seeping into her skin. She turned back once, hoping for reassurance, but the captain was already looking away, his gaze fixed on the horizon, unwilling to watch. The boat's engine roared, and within seconds, it was gone, leaving Aya alone on the pier of the abandoned city. Before her loomed Hashima's concrete towers, tall and broken, waiting like tombstones. The sea thundered behind her. The ruins stretched before her. Aya tightened her grip on her lantern and took her first step into the cursed island. Aya's footsteps echoed unnaturally as she stepped past the pier and into the skeletal remains of Hashima. The sound bounced off the crumbling walls, like voices mocking her intrusion. She paused, tilting her head, realizing just how wrong the silence felt here. It wasn't the simple absence of sound, but the kind of silence that waits, thick and oppressive, as though the island itself was listening. Concrete towers loomed above her on either side, their windows smashed out, black squares staring like hollow eyes. Vines crawled up the walls, gripping the grey stone as if trying to strangle the life out of it. Rusted steel beams jutted out at strange angles, corroded by years of salt and sea. The air reeked of mold and rust, damp and heavy, clinging to her skin. She wandered down a narrow alley where the walls leaned inward, pressing her into a corridor of shadow. Here, remnants of life lay scattered, as though the inhabitants had fled in panic. A child's shoe sat abandoned in the gutter, its laces still tied. A rusted tricycle leaned against a wall, its front wheel bent, a relic of laughter long silenced. Aya crouched to examine it, brushing away the dust, and felt an unexpected chill crawl down her spine. She pulled her hand back quickly, heart thudding. Inside one of the apartment blocks, the floor crunched beneath her boots. Broken glass and fragments of plaster littered the hallways, each step echoing through the emptiness. Doors stood ajar, revealing fragments of stories frozen in time. A kettle still perched on a stove, its surface blackened with rust. A faded calendar on the wall, frozen forever in 1974, the year the island was abandoned. She paused at one doorway, where light from her lantern revealed a small bedroom. The bed was still made, sheets yellowed with age, and on the nightstand sat a porcelain doll with cracked skin. One glass eye missing. Aya shuddered. The doll's remaining eye gleamed faintly in her lantern light, and for a brief moment, she could have sworn it was watching her. She backed away, her breath quickening. This wasn't just an abandoned home, it felt inhabited, as though the lives once lived here had never truly left. In another apartment, her lantern caught something half buried beneath dust, a photograph. She picked it up carefully, shaking off the grime. It was a family portrait, a mother, father, and two children sitting stiffly, their expressions neutral. But as Aya studied it, her stomach tightened. The faces seemed too sharp, too vivid, as if untouched by time. Worse, their eyes seemed to follow her, no matter how she turned the photo. With a gasp, she dropped it back onto the table, her pulse pounding in her ears. The deeper she went, the heavier the air grew. Her skin prickled, her instincts screaming that she was not alone. She paused, lantern trembling, and turned in a slow circle. Shadows danced across the walls, bending unnaturally with the flicker of the flame. Aya swallowed hard. Every instinct told her to leave, but her feet refused. Curiosity drove her further. Even as the island's silence pressed tighter around her chest, for the first time since stepping onto Hashima, she whispered aloud, just to hear her own voice. "It's just a place, just a place." But her words sounded strange, distorted by the echo, and when they came back to her, they did not sound like her voice at all. Aya tightened her grip on her lantern and pushed deeper into the ruins, unaware that something was already following. Afternoon waned as Aya wandered deeper into the labyrinth of crumbling apartments and narrow alleys. The air grew colder with each passing hour, and though the sun still hovered above the horizon, its light seemed to die before it touched the island. Shadows clung to the walls like stains, thickening unnaturally, lengthening as though pulled by unseen hands. Aya paused in one corridor where the concrete ceiling had partially collapsed, scattering rubble across the floor. She lifted her lantern higher, its dim glow struggling against the encroaching darkness. That was when she noticed it. The shadows did not fall as they should. They stretched in directions the light did not dictate, curling up walls, twisting across ceilings. They bent toward her, as if drawn to her presence. Her pulse quickened. She turned sharply, expecting to catch the source of movement. Nothing. Just empty hallways lined with broken doors. But the silence had changed. It wasn't stillness anymore. It was watchfulness. She could feel it, the weight of invisible eyes pressing on her back. A sudden gust of wind funneled through the corridor, rattling the rusted doors. One of them slammed shut with a violent crack. Aya jumped, her breath catching in her throat. The sound echoed far longer than it should have, bouncing down the halls like mocking laughter. She steadied herself, clutching the lantern tightly, whispering, "Just the wind, just the wind." Yet even as she said it, she didn't believe it. She reached an open courtyard where weeds pushed through cracked concrete, their twisted stems shivering in the cold air. The skeletal frames of laundry poles still stood, lines of wire sagging between them. On one wire hung a single tattered shirt, stiff with age, swaying slightly, despite the absence of any breeze. Aya's mouth went dry. She stared at it, waiting, until she realized the fabric wasn't just swaying, it was reaching. Each slow movement stretched a little further toward her, as if pulled by invisible fingers. Her lantern flickered, and with it, the courtyard seemed to shift. For a heartbeat, the shadows lengthened into human shapes. Dozens of them, men, women, and children, standing in silence, their features blurred by darkness. Aya's chest tightened, panic clawing at her ribs. She blinked, and they were gone, nothing but shadows once more. She stumbled back into the alley, her breathing ragged. The walls groaned, as though the island itself resented her intrusion. The metallic scent of rust grew sharper, mixed now with something else, something sweet and foul, like rotting flesh. Aya gagged, covering her mouth. The smell seemed to come from everywhere at once, bleeding out of the walls, the floor, the very air. Dusk finally settled. The last rays of the sun vanished behind the horizon, and the island transformed. Darkness poured through every crack, and the once faded ruins now felt alive, pulsing with unseen energy. Aya's lantern became her only lifeline, its weak glow carving a fragile path through the encroaching black. She whispered again, though her voice trembled, "It's just a place." But the island answered her with silence, so deep it roared. And in that silence, Aya knew the truth. The shadows weren't simply stretching, they were reaching. Aya's footsteps slowed as she reached the edge of a collapsed courtyard, where the buildings gave way to yawning tunnels that burrowed deep into the earth. Here the air felt different, heavier, denser, almost suffocating. A chill rose from the black mouths of the mine shafts, carrying with it the sharp stench of coal dust and damp stone. Though the mines had been sealed for decades, Aya's throat tightened. It was as if the tunnels themselves still breathed. She crouched near one of the entrances, her lantern casting a trembling glow across rusted tracks that disappeared into the dark. The rails were bent and twisted, corroded by salt and time, yet they gleamed faintly, as though slick with fresh moisture. Beside them sat a mining cart, half buried in rubble, its wheels frozen in place. Aya's fingers brushed against its edge and recoiled instantly. The cold was biting, unnatural, far sharper than the evening air. Then she heard it, a sound so faint she thought at first it was the sea. But no, this was different, metallic, rhythmic, clang, clang, the sound of pickaxes striking stone. Her heart lurched into her throat. She froze, her body rigid, every nerve on fire. She leaned forward slightly, listening. The sound echoed from deep within the tunnels, hollow and distant, yet unmistakable. One strike followed another, steady as a heartbeat, as though the mines were still alive with labor. Aya swallowed hard, her breath quickening. "It's just the wind," she whispered to herself, though the words rang false even to her own ears. The clanging grew louder, sharper, reverberating through the air until it rattled in her chest. It wasn't alone either. Other sounds joined it, the scrape of shovels, the groan of wooden beams, the faint rumble of voices, men's voices, low and mournful. They rose from the depths in a chorus of labor songs, ancient words she didn't understand. Their tones carried sorrow, exhaustion, and something darker, despair, that seemed to seep into the walls themselves. Aya's skin prickled. It was impossible. These men were long dead, and yet, here they were, their work echoing eternally beneath the stone. Her lantern flickered violently, the flame shrinking, as though afraid. The shadows around her thickened, curling across the ground. For a moment, she swore she saw shapes moving within the tunnel, dark silhouettes swaying like weary laborers. One bent to lift an invisible load, another dragged a tool that screeched across the rails. Aya stumbled back, her boot crunching over loose gravel. The clang of metal ceased instantly. The silence that followed was worse than the sound itself, a silence that waited, thick with awareness. She knew without doubt that whatever lingered below had heard her. Then came a single, echoing strike. Clang, louder than before, sharp as thunder. It rattled the broken glass in nearby windows. Her lantern dimmed almost too black, and in the weak light, she thought she saw dozens of eyes gleaming from the tunnel's mouth, hollow, black, unblinking. Her chest constricted, every instinct screaming for her to run. Yet her legs felt heavy, rooted to the spot. She clutched her lantern tighter, whispering a shaky prayer, though she wasn't sure to whom. The island's silence returned. But Aya knew better. The mines weren't empty. They had never been empty. And now, the dead who labored below were listening for her next step. Aya's breath hitched as the darkness in the mine shifted. At first it was subtle, a ripple in the shadows, a tremor along the stone. Then, from the black, shapes began to emerge. Not fast, not sudden, but slow, deliberate, as if pulled by invisible threads. The first figure stepped into the edge of her lantern light. It was a man, or what remained of one. His body was gaunt, skeletal, his skin ashen and grey, stretched tightly over protruding bones. His clothes hung in tatters, the remnants of a miner's uniform stained with coal dust that seemed fused into his flesh. His hollow eyes gleamed faintly in the dark, not with life, but with something far older. Aya staggered back, clutching her lantern as if its fragile flame could protect her. But the man wasn't alone. More followed, one after another, spilling out of the tunnel like a funeral march. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, their movements eerily synchronized, swaying like reeds in a phantom breeze. Their tools came with them, Pickaxes dragged along the ground, screeching against the broken rails. Shovels scraped as though still digging at unseen coal. The sound was unbearable, metal grinding against stone, rising into a chorus of labor that no living throat could sustain. And beneath it all, the voices returned, deep, mournful chants that seemed to vibrate the very air. Aya's heart hammered wildly, her chest aching with every shallow breath. The figures didn't look at her, not at first. They marched past in silence, their faces turned downward, as if chained to the memory of endless work. But then one of them lifted his head, his neck cracked with emotion, and his eyes locked onto hers. Black voids, empty, yet pulling her in. Aya gasped, stumbling backward. Others followed his gaze. One by one, the procession turned toward her. Their hollow eyes reflected the trembling flame of her lantern. Hundreds of dark mirrors that swallowed the light hole. Their mouths began to move, muttering words she couldn't understand. The chant grew louder, broken syllables echoing off the concrete until it felt like the walls themselves were speaking. Aya tried to retreat, but the ground beneath her seemed to tilt, sucking her back toward the tunnel. Her lantern flickered, shadows leaping grotesquely across the walls. The spirits stepped closer, their bodies swaying unnaturally, their feet making no sound against the stone. She could hear their breaths now, ragged, wheezing gasps, as though lungs long dead still strained for air. The stench hit her next. A thick, choking odor of coal, sweat, and rot enveloped her. Aya gagged, pressing her sleeve against her mouth, tears stinging her eyes. She stumbled sideways, but they followed, their forms dissolving and reforming in the mist, always closer, always surrounding her. One figure broke from the crowd. He dragged a shattered pickaxe, sparks hissing as metal scraped stone. He stopped just a few feet away. His lips trembled, opening slowly. For a moment, no sound came. Then, in a broken voice that rattled through her bones, he spoke. "You shouldn't be here." The words were not a threat, but a sentence, a truth carved in stone. Aya's knees buckled, and she nearly dropped her lantern. The chorus behind him grew louder, the chant swelling into a roar of anguish and fury. The dead had noticed her, and the island was no longer content to let her walk among its ruins. Aya's lantern trembled in her grip, its flame a frail heartbeat against the ocean of shadows pressing in from every side. The figure with the shattered pickaxe stood closest, his hollow eyes fixed on her, his body twitching as if pulled by invisible strings. His cracked lips parted again, and the voice that spilled out was like coal dragged across iron, broken, guttural, impossible, yet undeniably real. "Shouldn't be here." The words pierced her chest like ice. They weren't shouted. They weren't even spoken with anger. They carried a weight of sorrow, a warning soaked in centuries of despair. Aya's throat tightened, her breath ragged. For the first time since setting foot on the island, she felt something stronger than fear, guilt. It was as though she had intruded on a funeral that had never ended, disrupting the restless sleep of the damned. But the silence didn't last. Behind the first figure, the rest of the procession stirred. Dozens of heads tilted up in unison, their necks creaking with grotesque pops, their mouths opened, and whispers spilled out like smoke. At first it was a murmur, incomprehensible syllables rasping from withered throats. Then, as if one will bound them all, their voices aligned. A chant, "Aya, her name," spoken again and again, a chorus of the dead reverberating off every wall. The sound wasn't merely heard, it invaded her, it slithered into her ears, crawled beneath her skin, echoed inside her skull until her vision blurred. She clamped her hands over her ears, screaming, but it made no difference. The voices were inside her now. Her knees gave out, and she collapsed onto the cold concrete. The lantern nearly fell from her grasp, its flame sputtering as if suffocating under the weight of their voices. She squeezed her eyes shut, tears burning down her cheeks, whispering to herself, "This isn't real. This isn't real. This isn't real." But the island mocked her with every breath. The chanting grew louder, filling the ruined corridors, shaking dust loose from the ceilings as though the very bones of Hashima had joined the dead in there. "Warning, you shouldn't be here." The phrase wove through the chant like a commandment. Her name, the warning, her name again, an endless cycle of sound that stripped away her willpower piece by piece. She wanted to run, but her legs refused. The ground beneath her palms vibrated faintly, like a drumbeat beneath the earth. She realized with horror that it wasn't the ground at all. It was the island itself, breathing, listening. The first ghost leaned closer, his face inches from hers, His skin flaked away like ash, drifting into the mist, yet his presence was suffocating. She could see the outline of his jaw, the dark hollows where eyes should have been. His breath, if it could be called that, was cold enough to sting her skin. "Leave, or join us." The words rattled through her bones, sinking into her chest like chains. Aya sobbed, shaking violently, but the message was clear. She wasn't being threatened. She was being offered a choice, though deep down, she knew it was no choice at all. The island never let anyone go. The chorus behind him grew deafening, rising to a roar that shook the air. Aya staggered to her feet, clutching the lantern to her chest, her mind reeling. The warning was not a mercy, it was an omen. She was already marked on. Hashima's ghosts were not finished with her yet. Owaye bolted, her legs, stiff with fear only moments before, finally obeyed the primal instinct, screaming inside her head, "Run!" She clutched the lantern close, its dim flame bouncing violently as she stumbled through the debris-strewn corridors. Behind her, the chorus of whispers rose into a howl. Dozens, no hundreds of voices calling her name in broken unison. "Aya! Aya!" The sound chased her like a tide, flooding the ruins, filling every space with their hunger. The island seemed to twist around her. Corridors she had walked before now stretched endlessly, their walls narrowing until they felt like throats closing in. Stairs she swore had led upward now spiraled down into deeper darkness. Aya's breaths came sharp and ragged, each one scraping her lungs as if the air itself resisted her survival. The lantern flickered, shadows leaping grotesquely across the walls, some of them too sharp, too defined, as though they belonged to figures running alongside her just beyond sight. She burst into an abandoned classroom. Desks were overturned, chalk still smeared across a cracked blackboard, words half erased but frozen in time. For a fleeting second, Aya thought she had escaped the voices. Her chest heaved, sweat dripping down her face. Then came the sound footsteps, not hers, heavy, deliberate, echoing against the hollow concrete. One pair became two, two became many. The floorboards groaned, desks shifted as though unseen bodies brushed past them. Her lantern sputtered. In its dying glow, she saw them, pale figures standing in the corners of the room, their heads tilted, their eyes empty voids reflecting her flame. Their mouths opened slowly, and though no breath escaped, the voices returned, this time inside her skull. "You can't run!" Aya screamed and shoved her way out, crashing through the door and into another corridor. Her boots pounded against the floor, sending echoes spiraling into the dark. But the island mocked her. Every hallway looked the same. Peeling paint, rusted pipes, doors yawning open into shadows. It was a maze, designed not by architecture but by malice, reshaping itself to keep her inside. She stumbled on a broken step, falling hard onto her hands. Pain shot up her arm, but she forced herself up. Behind her, the air shimmered with movement. Shapes emerged from the mist that seeped through cracks in the wallsmen, with coal-stained faces. Women with hollow stares, children whose tiny hands stretched toward her with silent cries. Their numbers grew with every second, the ruined corridors spilling them out like veins carrying blood. Aya fled into a courtyard, weeds clawing at her boots. The moon had risen, but its light barely touched the island. The mist consumed it, leaving her world painted in grey. The voices grew louder, their chant now thunder, shaking the glass in the windows above her. Shadows leaned from the apartment walls, reaching, stretching unnaturally long. For one terrifying moment, she realized they weren't shadows at all, but the echoes of the dead, clinging to her every movement. Her lantern's flame shrank to a pinprick, then flared weakly, struggling for life. Aya's breaths turned to sobs. Her body screamed for rest, but she couldn't stop. Not here, not now. She threw herself down another alley, her vision blurring. The walls groaned, dust falling in choking clouds. The very island seemed to pulse around her, alive, reshaping itself with every step. And always, the voices followed. Aya, Aya, Aya. By now she understood the truth. She wasn't running from them. She was running inside them. The whole island was their body, their trap, their grave. And no matter how fast she moved, she was already caught. Aya stumbled into what had once been the island's central square, her lungs burning, her lantern's flame a faint trembling ember. All around her, the towering apartment blocks loomed like tombstones, their windows gaping open, dark and endless. The mist had thickened until it swirled in heavy coils, curling around her body like chains. She spun in every direction, searching desperately for an escape, but every path folded back into shadow. The island had reshaped itself into a trap. The voices were no longer whispers. They had become a storm. 1,000 throats cried her name in unison, the sound shaking the cracked concrete beneath her feet. Aya, Aya, Aya. The chorus pressed into her ears, into her mind, until her own thoughts fractured under the weight. She dropped to her knees, clutching her head, sobbing. Please, stop. Her voice was a pitiful fragment, swallowed by the roar. Then, silence. The sudden absence of sound was worse than the noise itself. Her ears rang, her chest heaved, and in that stillness, she felt them. Hands cold, clammy, countless hands closing over her arms, her shoulders, her back. Invisible at first, then visible in the lantern's last dying glow. Pale fingers stretched from the shadows, gaunt hands reaching from broken doorways, skeletal grips tightening around her legs. She tried to fight, to wrench free, but her body was frozen in their grasp. The island itself was pulling her down. Her lantern flickered once more, then died. Darkness consumed everything, and in that darkness, the figures emerged fully. Miners, mothers, children, all with hollow eyes and mouths that gaped soundlessly, their faces twisted with sorrow. They encircled her, their bodies swaying in a rhythm that felt older than the sea itself. The first ghost she had seen, the one with the shattered pickaxe, stepped forward. His jaw moved slowly, painfully, until words scraped out once again. "You shouldn't be here," the chant resumed, softer now, but more dreadful for it. "Join us." The phrase wove through the air like a net, binding her, pulling her deeper into the island's heart. Aya screamed, thrashing against the tide of hands, but her voice cracked and broke. No one would hear her. No one ever did. The ground beneath her feet shuddered and gave way. She was dragged down into the earth, into the black veins of the mines. The walls closed around her, stone pressing into her chest, coal dust filling her lungs. The last thing she saw before the dark swallowed her whole was a wall of hollow eyes glowing faintly in the mist. By dawn, the sea was calm. The boat, Aya, had chartered bobbed quietly near the pier, its engine cold, its captain absent. On the shore, only her lantern remained, its glass cracked, its flame forever extinguished. The villagers would whisper of her, adding her name to the long list of souls claimed by Hashima, and they would remind each other never to set foot on the cursed island after dark. But at night, when the wind carried just right across the sea, some swore they could hear her, Aya's voice, crying, calling, begging to be freed. The island never answered. It never needed to, for Hashima does not release its dead, it keeps them, it feeds on them. And now, Aya had joined their chorus, another voice in the endless silence of the abandoned city,